Just say when.
You're,
Okay, when. All right, good morning. Today is January 9th, 2024. It is 10 a.m. and this is the meeting of Senate Natural Resources and Energy. We're continuing our work on S213, and activating the regulation of wetland river corridor development and dam safety. And we're picking back up where we left off last week. We have two guests with us this morning. Ms. Oates was sort of cut off midstream, no pun intended, because we ran short of time. So she's back. And also we have Mike Klein, a river ecologist, and who's been in this committee many times before. He retired from ANR, and it's good to see you back. So good morning, Mr. Klein. Thanks for helping us. Just so the committee knows, I asked Mr. Klein to talk to us about, the river science, et cetera, as well as the bill. And so with that, the floor is yours. And again, good to see you, and thanks so much for taking the time to prepare materials for us and to come back in and educate us once again.
Well, good morning, Chair Gray. My name is Mike Klein, and I am a river ecologist and fluvial geomorphologist. I am retired from the Department of Environmental Conservation, where I served as Rivers Program Manager from 2009 to 2019. I led the science and management team in the development of river corridor planning and protection. And I served as Program Manager during the response and recovery from Tropical Storm Irene. I was responsible for the development of the emergency stream alteration and river corridor protection standards and rules that were adopted after Irene in 2015 as required by Act 138. Before I go on with the rest of my oral testimony, I would like to share with you a little bit more about the science of river corridors and floodplains, and do my best to give you all better idea of what is the difference between the river corridor and the floodplain, and why are we concerned about river corridors.
Can I add to your list of things you're gonna help us define and explain for us? As it fits in, if you can also help spell out how we also talk about riparian buffers relate to those two terms, and how we also talk about wetlands. And it seems like they're all interconnected, but we talk about them as discrete things. Sometimes it's a little hard for me to know which foot we're standing on.
Certainly, and if at any time members of the committee have a question or would like to interject with one of those topics, please feel free to interrupt me.
Thanks so much.
I'm going to do a little standing during this presentation because I think it's really important to point out to you on some of these slides exactly what I'm talking about. What I've shown in the very top of this diagram is the cross section of a stream that you might see in its natural condition in a valley in Vermont. You have the hill slopes coming down, you have a floodplain, you have the active river channel, and then the side slopes going up to the other hillside. This configuration really is the floodplain and the river channel. The floodplain consists of sediments that were brought down over the eons since the last glacier, deposited by the river, and accessed by the river on a fairly regular basis. Scientists explain that floodplain feature is typically accessed by the river maybe 7 days out of a year. A couple floods, maybe a springtime flood, a fall or summertime flood, but the river has access to that feature. And it's on that floodplain that the water spreads out. It keeps the depth of the overall water in the channel lower when it spreads out. And it also does another very important function, which we'll talk about in the context of river corridors, and that's it dissipates the energy of the river. Imagine the power of when the river's coming down through the valley. The more resistance that flow experiences, the less powerful it is. All right, so when it spreads out, you get this lower depth, less power, and less erosion. Now, I'm sorry, so you're watching, good.
H is greater than HC? What is that?
It's a long time since I explained that, but it's the height, it has to do with the height of. Actually, I'm just not gonna go there
That's
because
okay.
I will mess it up,
No worries.
but
I
I,
can asterisk that or
yeah, we'll add
fit
it.
it and, you know,
It's been a long time since I
No
thought
worries.
about what that is.
I understand.
So I'm gonna skip that, sorry.
No, it's okay.
Anyway, so then what happened in Vermont? Over the course of the last 200 years, there has been a whole series of activities that have changed this relationship between the river channel and its floodplain. There's been historically, there was deforestation, 70 to 80% of the state was cleared. And during that period of time, a tremendous amount of gulling and erosion took place on our hill slopes, bringing tremendous amount of sediment into the valleys. And so our valleys graded or built up over time. When we were looking at a lot of the stream bank work that was done in Vermont, and some of the archaeologists came out and explained to us that anywhere from 2 to 5 feet of material was overlaying the original floodplain feature with recent sediments that came down during this period of deforestation. Right, so it built up the banks. This condition was intolerable to the early settlers of our state, who were trying to build transportation corridors and farm the land and build our settlements, because the rivers were graded all over the place from this tremendous amount of sediment that was coming into our valleys. So what happened was there was a lot of dredging, snagging, straightening, and armoring of our rivers. All these activities we call stream channelizations. Streams were literally moved and deepened to try to make room for our use of the valley floors. All right.
Did you say the word snagging?
Snagging means taking the wood out, pulling all the materials out so that it flows more smoothly down the channel. All right. They wanted to dry out the land. They wanted to be able to use the valley floors for all the various things that we do. And they needed to try to control the rivers, the flow of that water. So what happened is from all these activities, we energized the river. We put the river into this narrower, deeper channel. And when we did that, we made the streams more powerful. All right. Well, I'll cover later that stream power is a function of the slope of the water and the depth of the water. And we did both. We straightened the streams, we made them steeper. And we dredged and deepened the streams in this very deep sediments that came down from the valley slopes. And thereby deepening the flow. And so we ended up with this, what we call the sized condition of our streams. Now, because the stream is more powerful, it starts eroding. It starts eroding both the bed and the banks until the bed coarsens up and it starts to do this widening process. And eventually, if left alone completely, the stream will start to deposit again in this lower condition and rebuild a floodplain at this other elevation. The old floodplain becomes what we call a terrace. It's no longer as active of a floodplain as it would have been originally. That doesn't mean that the floods can't access it. Many of our terraces are flooded during extreme events. But that normal 7-day-a-year cycle of river coming up out of its banks and accessing its floodplain is not occurring as frequently. And so we started collecting data on this condition in Vermont back in 2005. We assessed thousands of miles of river in Vermont. We literally went out with survey equipment and we developed cross sections of our streams. We understood the hydrology of when the river was accessing these floodplains. And what we found is that 75% of our stream channels are in this condition, in size, deepened, and still somewhat straightened condition. And so what that told us was that there was a tremendous amount of river process, river evolution, and river movement that was yet to come as the river worked towards this more stable condition is depicted below. So what was really fascinating about this from my perspective was that when FEMA came to Vermont in the 70s and started surveying our rivers to develop our flood maps for the National Flood Insurance Program, and many of those maps that were created back in the 70s and 80s are still in effect today. They haven't changed. They did the surveying when the rivers were in this configuration.
So unstable.
It was unstable and more of the flood water was being contained within the channel than what would normally have spread out on a floodplain. So what happened with this is you got a condition like this, where the FEMA maps, the National Flood Insurance maps, are showing that the flood hazard area, this is an extreme example, but it illustrates the point that the 100-year flood, according to FEMA, is enclosed within the channel itself.
So the pink is that that would they would be marking.
That's right, that would be the published flood hazard area, 100-year flood. That FEMA is putting up to the communities.
Sorry to interrupt again. So the term flood hazard area as opposed to floodplain, as opposed to river.
Right. The flood hazard area is a floodplain as delineated by FEMA, where what they calculate to be the 100-year flood would extend to laterally. All right, so what this pink map, if you're a prospective landowner that wants to build a home and you're going by your local flood hazard bylaw and you go and you look at where is it safe to build? And you see, oh, well, this spot right here is safe to build. I'm not in the flood hazard area. I can put my house right there. Many of our flood hazard maps, which were the official sort of development guide, was telling us all that it was safe to build in a place where this channel evolution process was occurring. All right, so for instance, here's two structures that were not in the flood hazard area in Waitsfield, Vermont, as published by FEMA. Now, we know that's structure is not that's, but you wouldn't want to live there either, would you? So the Mad River was in this location was a classic case where the river was extremely deepened and straight. And during a flood in the 90s, I believe it was 95, it suddenly burst out. It got to that critical point where it started that widening process. And it's continued to do that. This continued through that evolutionary process, and now parts of that upper Mad River are in that fourth stage of the process. It's widened out, new floodplains are forming at that lower elevation, and so the energy in the flood is being dissipated in that wider condition.
You know what town we're in?
This is Waitsfield. Waitsfield and Warren, it's right kind of close to the boundary there.
Okay. Like around Little Farms.
Yeah. So, here's some examples of the channel change that we've seen in Vermont rivers. If you're on Lewis Creek, there's no question that the Lewis Creek in Starksboro is moving. You don't need to be a fluvial geomorphologist to know you don't want to put your house in the middle of that. But in some of these other rivers, take the third branch of the White River in Randolph. straighten in the 20s. Okay, steeper, deeper, more powerful, third branch. Flood of 1927 energized that system. And it started moving. And you can see the successive channel locations in a very dynamic system.
Do you have, I know that you're describing changes that happened, like with this particular flood. That was a hurricane. What we experienced this time was dampening of the soil just through rain, a very extended rain event. Do you mind, as you go along, describing where you might see differences in that? Because it feels like we're gonna be experiencing more of just heavy rain events.
Yeah, I'm always a little mystified in our state. Flood hazard planning, where we call these events by different names.
Yeah.
Hurricanes, heavy storms, big precipitation, it's all a lot of water in the channel. And it's, so when you're looking at that, it's different reasons for the flood.
But it has the
In
same,
Montpelier, I lived through 3 reconstructions in Montpelier. Lost belongings in a truck in 92. But, each of those floods occurred for a different reason, right? So.
so it's the river won't necessarily react differently based on the type of event.
I mean, certain events spike the flow very quickly. And it's that peak magnitude of flood that is when the most energy is going to be in the system. Other storms are more long lasting, and that heat might rise more slowly and less severely in their life, be a different amount of energy in the system. All right. So there are differences, but it all comes down to how deep is the water.
Okay,
At the height of the flood.
thank you.
Some of these images show, though, great lags between when that stream or river was in a straightened condition and when it's got energized and started moving. So if you're in that 20, 30, 40-year period where not much is happening, the signal you're getting as a community is this is safe, the river's never been here. And the investments and the structures begin. So, understanding that what we're talking about happens over very long periods of time. And that is a very difficult thing for many of us to grasp, and get our heads around, was the time and the space associated with these changes. So going back to river corridors then, now try to bring into some of these other terms, Senator Bray, that you mentioned. We said, okay, if our rivers, many of our rivers are going through this evolutionary process, and the official inundation maps aren't serving Vermont, what do we do to explain the hazards? And so we came up with the river corridor concept again in the early 2000s. They are based on that ultimate meander geometry of the river, what we call the plan form of the river, what we see is the extent of that process. And it's as played out in this evolution, and said, here's the river corridor. If we try to capture that process and give the river the space that it needs to get to the more stable slope and more stable depth, we'll reach a condition of least erosion over time. We'll reach the condition where we are also creating floodplain. And here's where we kind of square away the confusion between floodplain and river corridor. They overlap. You saw in the one picture where the river corridor was much wider than the floodplain. But in the more stable condition, as shown up here at the first and the last cross section, the river corridor and the floodplain feature are almost the same. It may not be the floodplain that the river first created after the glaciers receded. When you think about the width of some of our valleys is quite wide. But how much space does the river need to get to that stable geometry and have sufficient floodplain such that the bed of the river stays stable? That's what this measurement is about, is giving the river adequate meander space in terms of energy dissipation and adequate floodplain space in terms of keeping the depth spread out during floods as a means of creating more stable channel. So that's kind of the science behind some of our calculations.
Jim McCormick.
Are you saying, are you saying that we should let the rivers meander because that's what rivers do? Or are you saying that if we let the rivers meander, they will at some point come to a stable shape where they don't meander anymore, that this is where they've decided?
No, they will. The
Always
dynamic
meander.
planform change occurs, as you saw in that. The Starksboro picture of Lewis Creek, it covered the same ground many times. What's stable is the slope. All right, and if you read this definition of a river corridor, it's saying that it's accommodating the dimensions, slope, and planform and buffer necessary for the natural maintenance and natural restoration of the dynamic equilibrium and the minimization of erosion hazard. What that means is that if we get that geometry, the slope, the cross-section and depth, and the position of the river, no matter where it is in that change, we're not going to, we're going to minimize the extent to which the river grades, fills in with sediment, and we're going to minimize the extent to which the river erodes. All right, and I'm going to show a slide here in a minute that shows that equilibrium concept, where we don't eliminate change, but we minimize the extent of that, or the rate of that change, the sensitivity of that change over time. And so the river corridor concept came about because we knew that the floodplain maps weren't really expressing the extent of that river change. We'll dance there.
Go. Can you, so the FEMA mapping that got done in the 70s and 80s, can you show within that blue section, how much, it sounds like to me, it's a narrower portion.
Right.
Can you
So
point out how FEMA mapped it as opposed to what the full river corridor is?
So when if FEMA, let's say, came back in 1820 and they ran their models, they would have seen a flood hazard area or a 100-year floodplain that looked like this from this edge to this edge. Because they came at the height of the incision and they measured, okay, if we get a cross section like this down through the valley, and we run what we think is the 100-year flood through that channel in our model, that flood is going to stay within these banks. And so that's why it's such a narrow band, because the surveying was done in that time period where the rivers were being energized. We had really big floods in 73 and 76 on the Vermont, statewide events. This energized many of these systems tremendously, and that's when a lot of them cut down their beds and deepened in size more severely. I said after Irene that most of the damage we're seeing after Irene was because of the work we did after the 73 and 76, put the rivers back and then deepen them.
With the armoring.
The armoring, the dredging that occurred after the floods in the 70s, to put the rivers back is really set the rivers up to be re-energized during Irene and cause as much damage as these stomach beginnings that we saw.
I'm getting the feeling that we like to think we're managing the river, but the river is managing us.
That's really largely true. So, the challenge of modern river management, understanding this science, is that how much can we avoid putting rivers back exactly to their most dangerous form?
Was the river signs that were here going with not well understood when they were here in the seventies or eighties, or was just
And
it's
it's,
an accident that they were here at the moment of greatest incision?
there's many great people that work for, our federal agencies and FEMA. But to this day, their models do not consider sediment erosion and aggregation. They practice what is called clear water hydrology, strictly water. And that's where the fluviogeomorphology comes in. It's the study of how the land and water interact and how that a river is more than just the flowage of water. It's the flowage of water, sediment, and debris. And it's to understand those three things, is to understand channel geometry and channel elevation. So this is how the river corridor concept was born, and the relationship between a floodplain and the river corridor. The river corridor trying to serve both the function of slope, giving the river the slope it needs, and the function of depth, giving it enough floodplain that it will become less of those things.
Never done.
Oh, I'm trying to remember exactly when, but I tried to get, the state has a table of its, the surface and lakes.
Oh, yes.
And it has sand in it, and it pumps water in one end and it drains it out the other end. And I was trying to get it to take to the Tunbridge Fair,
Oh,
and unfortunately, I was trying to do it as part of a political party's event for people to come and play and enjoy the thing, and I mean, that you're describing that table,
Exactly.
without having the table here and having to use words.
Yeah.
And
We used to set our table up down the hall.
yeah, I think that's what.
And we would show this process.
You tried lately?
You have to talk to my colleagues in A and R, they still have the flumes. And ask.
The table still exists.
Yeah, they do exist, and many groups around the state have purchased them now and take them to fairs and take them to schools, and it's a great tool for teaching. You know, a process that takes 50 years, you can do in 10 minutes.
And then people could step up to the table and
Yeah,
attempt their fixes
exactly,
to stop the problem that they watch unfold before them.
exactly,
And rather entertaining.
I didn't come prepared to talk about it at length today, but after Irene, we started a training program called Rivers and Roads. And Rivers and Roads brought transportation people from all over the state, including V-Trains, in to teach them these processes, because they're in the front lines of this evolution process. And road foreman who really thought this science was a lot of bunk, got stepped up to those tables and implemented what they thought should happen to the stream, and they watched. And that's when they became really interested in learning about some of these processes.
There's one more definition question.
Yeah, get the realtors in there next.
Plan form
Plan form.
refers to the contours, like the topology, or
You might remember that here. Here we go. This is the plan form. All right, it's the meander shape. Bird's eye view of the river meander shape. That's what we call the plan form.
Can I add something?
yeah, please.
Does it include all of them across time, or does it include just like 2003, it's here? Like, does the plan form change, or is it?
The plan form changes.
Okay.
But what is predictable about the plan form is the stream maintaining the same slope.
Okay.
So even though it may change its location, it's keeping the same length. All right, and I'm going to show that in a couple slides at the end, how it's really the length of the river is ultimately what tells the slope and dictates the power. So it's when a river goes from a straightened condition like this to a longer length, it reduces the slope and reduces the power.
Senator Cormier.
Okay. Feedback from the people I represent. I live right on the main branch of the White River. We got people whose families have been there since the 18th century. And there are certain practices which are seen as historical and also seen as common sense. One of which is, and you saw it not that long ago, which is when they were constructing the interstate.
Mhm.
In Bethel, they were pulling gravel the White River.
Yeah,
And it made a deeper, narrower, and therefore colder river.
uh-huh.
And it was somewhat famous as a fishing stream. People for years came to the famous great fishing stream and were disappointed once we stopped pulling the gravel out. If we let the river be, will it eventually channel so that it's cold again?
Well,
Or is it gonna always be a shallow,
Yeah.
wide?
it'll go through an ugly period of being shallow and wide when we're here, okay? And then when the river goes, you take a channel like this, if you dig it out and dredge it and make it deeper for a certain amount of time, it could be colder. Deeper water generally doesn't take as much incident of light from the sun and becomes colder. But as the channel evolves and these meander bends form, you get deep, very deep pools at the outside meander bends. So even though you might not have the same depth along the entire channel,
You have pools.
you have force against these bends that can sometimes triple the average depth of the channel. And that's where the fishing is. All right, so it's not a matter of eliminating fishing, it's just sort of retraining the angler to say, okay, I'm going from a deep channel all along its length to I gotta fish pools. And learn how the water moves through the channel and where the fish are gonna be residing. A channel like this is going to have a lot of variable width and depth and velocity combinations, and that's what trout and salmon thrive on. Is there's niches for all of those different life stages of trout. And when we make a river straighter and steeper, we might favor some age classes of that population, but others won't survive, especially during flood years. So the ecology of the river really does depend on a lot of these same principles I was talking about.
And one more thing. A constituent of mine, for whom I have great respect, it's a guy I've known for years, he's a selectman in Rochester, farmer. He has said about pulling gravel out, he's saying, I respect the idea of letting the river do what's natural. That all we want to do is pull our roads back out of the river. That gravel is our gravel, it's our roads, and they wash into the river. And we just want to pull them back out, put them back to the roads.
Well, I understand the sentiment, but
It's hard to
the
answer.
river owned that gravel first.
Have a stand at the table and try it.
The river took it back.
So, here's another picture of the river corridor meander belt concept. And, again, in this picture, it's very clear what the meander belt of that river is. Because you have these meander scars that are filled with water. And we use those meander scars when we're mapping. We can see the extent of the geometry of that channel and helping us.
Did you say meander scars?
See these features right here, these are old meanders. During lower flow conditions, there's no water there, but right after a flood, we can see them all on the landscape.
So you use the term scars.
Yeah, I use the term scars.
Like fingerprints.
Yeah. So, wetlands. Wetlands, these features that the river created and periodically fill with water and fine sediment, develop wetland soils and wetland plants. And we see these floodplain wetlands that are formed. there's many wetlands that are not in these main floodplain areas. They're outside, vernal pools and whatnot. I'm not yet wetland expert, but many of our wetlands are in these valley locations, and interactions with the river and the flooding of the river have helped create and maintain those wetlands over time. And it's where a lot of water retention occurs. When the floods fill these wetlands, they hold on to it like a sponge. More so than say some of the coarse or organic material, inorganic material, gravels and whatnot. So they're important riverine features. Riparian area, that's a little tougher to define because so many people define it in different ways, but it also overlaps all of these areas that I'm talking about. It is in the river valley. Many people have equated riparian area with a buffer. I'm one of those who prefer to just think about it in terms of the natural or native vegetation, and the whole ecosystem that might exist along the river. So you don't see much of a wooded riparian area along parts of this channel, but there are pieces of it that remain in that intact condition. And those trees have many different functions, both in the stream and along the stream. Ecologically, from a flood hazard standpoint, they help to slow the water. And from a water quality standpoint, they help to filter them up along the way. So that riparian area is, in my mind, really thinking about the ecology, the full ecology of that system and how that interacts with the hydraulics of the river.
Is it right, the impression I've got from hearing people talk about it is that it's the margin, it's the edge, the water's edge, wherever the water comes to be, but not an area, I don't know, hundreds of yards wide, it's just.
Again, you talk to one person and it's that little 25-foot or 50-foot area on the edge of the stream. You talk to others and it's hundreds of feet for the birds and the whole ecology. From a flood hazard standpoint, in creating roughness in the channel, slowing the floods down, certainly, the Rivers program has tried to say that first 50 feet is really where a lot of the bank stability comes in. But others might argue that it takes much more. And so that is a really variable concept. We had quite a bit of discussion about riparian areas actually when rivers build paths. And it was at that time that the legislature in Act 138 said to those of us in the Rivers program, take that meander belt and add a buffer. We did. So this meander corridor now includes an additional 50 feet either side of the red line, so that when the river does evolve to that full meander beltway, there's still enough space there for a forested cover to exist and provide that bank stability. So that's how all those terms sort of fit together. So really what I'm trying to convey is floodplains lower the depth and slow the water and is more related to the inundation of the land. The river corridor is trying to accommodate that length to get to that least erosive condition. So they're different functions, they overlap in the same place. And we do it because the public policy of planning around flood hazard areas vis-a-vis FEMA, flood insurance.
Can I ask one quick, so when we say riparian areas, we're focusing on, is it right to think of it? River corridors, we're focusing on the water. When we talk about riparian areas, we're talking about the same space, but we're focusing on the land elements.
To some extent, yes, although I would argue that the river corridor is that entire width over time. Yeah, over time.
There we go.
So when you say the entire width, you mean outside the red lines? Because there's scars outside the red lines on both sides.
Very good point, Senator. I mean, this is where Vermont's policy maybe differs from how some of the other states have approached this compared to other states that are working on improving erosion hazards. We try to show what is the minimal amount of space this river needs to get to that stable form.
That's politics.
That's policy.
That's politics.
And so, it's a policy matter to say. The river could take the entire valley. It built the valley. Every bit of the valley and the valley slopes is an erosion hazard, if you think about it. But if we did that, we would never be having this conversation about how do we move forward with, keeping it safe, because the entire valley would be the river corridor. And trust me, in having worked on the policies and programs of other states from Washington to Colorado to Indiana to here, nobody was taking the science into the policy arena because they're talking about everything. They're saying everything is a hazard. And so there's no room for people in that. And so policies are always debatable, but this is the direction that we've gone, and we've said, yes, the river was out here at one time. But if we give the river at least this much space, plus another 50 feet for the riparian area, then we can get to that more stable river condition. We can have a better ecology, we can have cleaner water, all these services that we talk about in terms of stable rivers.
It's a compromise.
It's a compromise.
Oh,
Right, that's right.
So we're in this period of 73% of the rivers being unstable. Can you give us a time frame for? I'm sure nature is gonna figure this out. I'm just wondering how long it takes.
Well, back before
Irene
Irene,
about this.
back before Irene, I used to say that, I've seen some rivers that have a good sediment supply, because it's the sediment supply that drives the process. I've seen rivers go through that evolutionary process in 10 years. 5 to 10 years, depending on how many floods you have. Other rivers that have a more clay type banks, more cohesive soils, they could be decades, they could be a century. Take the La Platte River in Heinsberg. Those are clay banks. And that straightened river will take a long time to evolve. It is evolving, it is changing. In my career, it's changed. But it's very slow compared to Lewis Creek right up over the hill.
So kind of building off of your question, so we're in this state where we have armored rivers, straight rivers, development right up to the edges in some cases. What would you recommend? I mean, do you recommend taking the armoring off? Do you recommend like finding places to cut into the walls to lower those edges so that rivers can re-access the floodplains? What do we do?
Well, in addition to just making sure we're not putting more investments within these 2 red lines that we then have to fortify, we are doing all of the above. We're trying to find ways from rebuilding our roadsides to building floodplains in village areas. To reconstituting our riparian areas. All of these practices, we hope, will add up to better flooding zones. We are collecting the data to right now, to be able to show how much of the Winooski River watershed, how much of the Winooski above Montpelier is still available to this process. And where are the best opportunities? It's an effort called Functioning Floodplain Initiative, where a lot of these encroachments have been mapped. We understand where there's opportunities to give them more space. But after Irene, there was the immediate response to fixing as many road banks. V-Trans was an amazing partner. We went back and fixed over 370 sites to make them as much compatible with this process as we could. You know, creating more vertical road banks with bigger rocks, cutting a little floodplain bench on the other side, all of these things to lower that depth and give a little bit more wiggle room for the river would mean less road damage in the future, and they saw that. And luckily, the Federal Highway Administration was paying for a lot of this stuff. And we did a lot of different things, and we continue. This Rivers and Roads training program has a lot of local road people approaching the agencies to help them with these practices. So it's an encouraging piece of it.
Continuing Senator Watson's question. It seems to me there's a lot of the human footprint in Vermont, if we had it to do over again, wouldn't be there at all. Given the Rob Roper is gonna have a lot of fun with it. And then he said, anyway, but that if you're thinking in terms of letting the river be. Then, and they're vulnerable. I'll use the town I live in, Bethel. The village is on just shy of a cliff, a very steep hill.
Yeah.
And in particular, I don't know if you're familiar with Church Street. Okay, it's basically, I think it's probably a glacial deposit, but it's not very wide and it's very steep, in particular on the downstream side. That there are buildings there that were, you look at them, they seem like probably they're gonna end up in the river in a couple of years. And that has been riprap. And dirty little secret, I supported the riprap.
Sure.
I don't like riprapping, I get the argument,
Yeah,
but there's the existing human footprint.
Absolutely.
About to be destroyed. So what do we do about, and there's a lot, Church Street in Bethel is an extreme example, but there's a lot of this all.
and this is something included in my oral testimony here that I hope to share. We have certain areas of our rivers that are completely hemmed in. I believe that's possible in certain locations, but impossible if we attempt to do it along its entire length. Right? Think about many places in Vermont where our rivers are in these wide alluvial valleys, meandering away, and they enter a rock gorge through a very steep, hardened place and come back out. It's fun. That's a natural river type. Okay, so I like to refer to this as the Montpelier Canyon. All right. And we committed to keeping the Winooski hemmed in this location. That may be possible if we respect the river's processes upstream. I don't believe it's possible if we put houses and more roads and more bike paths and everything else from here all the way up to Cabot. I think that becomes increasingly difficult. And what's confounding all this, of course, is the rate of these storms that we're getting. And that the time to understand how these systems are responding when we're hit every year, twice a year with these big floods. And that's where I know in my mind, I'm trying to recalculate, what does this mean? How much can we maintain certain infrastructure in certain community centers while we're trying to restore some of the storage upriver? And I don't have the answer to that question just yet.
In Middlebury, the wetlands south of Middlebury, I don't know to what degree it's accidental, or just sort of, we lucked out that it stayed farmland, it stayed swamp, it stayed this, that, and the other thing. I'm thinking, Irene, maybe was an estimate, maybe you did it, it said, Middlebury avoided $3 million worth of damage by virtue of having that giant sponge on Otter Creek to that upstream.
No, it's organizations like TNC and other conservation programs that came in and really protected that Otter Creek Valley over the last 50, 60 years that really allowed those wetland floodplain complexes to work. And so when the otter comes up, it spreads out. And instead of this huge peak of flow, quickly coming into the channel and racing down valley from Rutland to Middlebury. If the Otter Creek was dredged and straightened. Now spreads out and it's much shallower. And instead of going all at once, it gradually goes down the valley. And the flood depth doesn't increase, and that's why Middlebury is saving all that money. So this is a a diagram that I could probably spend the rest of the day on, but I read it. But it really tried to show that sort of equilibrium process that I keep mentioning, and it's really the geomorphologist sort of rule of thumb to be able to say, okay, we're adding water to the channel. What does that do? It tips it down and it becomes degradation or erosion. All right, we're increasing the power by straightening the river. What happens? It pulls it down, we're going towards erosion. We take away the resistance by pulling out all the trees and boulders and whatnot out of the rivers. It lowers the resistance, it becomes more erosion, it tips the bounds. So all of these things, this is our guide to where we don't necessarily need to do detailed hydrologic modeling on every little practice. What are we doing on this scale? How are we tipping it? And this is one of the things that we show our road foreman. When you change a culvert, this is how it tips the scale. When you give the river a little bit more space with that riprap job. This can give it a floodplain cut. This is what it does to the scale. And we know that we're moving in the direction of this more stable, least erosive condition. When we look at our practices through the lens of how we're tipping the balance. This stream power piece of it is really key, and it's the last one I'll try to drive home with this presentation. Is again, stream erosive power is a function of the slope of the water and the depth of the water. When we take the meanders out of a stream, when we straighten it, we shorten it. We make it steeper. We increase stream power.
It reminds me of skiing. You want to go fast, go on the fall line. If
Exactly,
you want to slow down, you start.
exactly, exactly.
If you're hiking up a hill, you use switch fence.
Yeah.
It's all the same physics. And in here, we're showing a river with a healthy relationship with its floodplain and riparian. And it is much shallower than when we contain that flood all within the channel. We increase the depth and increase the power. We go from here to here. So really what we're faced with in Vermont is where can we decrease power in our rivers? When we decrease power, that also means that we're increasing depth in one location of the watershed in order to reduce it in another. Imagine all that water coming down the Winooski, the Stevens branch, the Kingsbury branch, North branch, that is spreading out over floodplains, whether they're narrow or wide. And when that water is sitting in those floodplains, it's not coming down swiftly to the confluence of all these rivers in Montpelier. And so Montpelier stands a chance of having less water depth in its downtown if the water is sitting in those floodplains and riparian areas and riparian wetlands longer and coming back into the channel over a longer period of time. So that's the science I hope to share with you. We know so much and we care so much about our downtown becoming inundated and the tragedy to our businesses and what have you, but really this whole erosion piece that I shared today, we're seeing it in our transportation network more than anything. Of course, this is Route 4 in Rutland and Mendon. And Mendon Brook just remade its floodplain in one dramatic step. And as much as we could, when we put Route 4 back, V-Trans worked with our river engineers to invest a little bit more in how they built those riverbanks back in order to give the White River just, and the Mendon Brook and White River and some of these rivers in that part of the state, a little bit more space. You know, than what would have normally when, it's a little bit of a side, but normally when a flood hit and our road got washed out like this, we kind of just start dumping rocks until it's, you know, kind of built a stable 2-on-1 slope. When you think about our narrow river valley, it's sharing the valley with a road. And now the river's taking the road and you're coming in and filling that slope, you're essentially filling in the channel. And that's what used to happen in many of our post-recovery efforts, is we would just keep dumping rock until we got that stable size. The stream had nowhere to go. So the next flood, it just undermined rock and filled the road again. So now we're paying a little bit more money for bigger rock to allow us to go vertical and maintain that cross section of the channel next to the road. So these are the types of practices that we're learning. That it uses a little less, takes a little more money up front, but save us in the long run.
You know, why?
Sorry, can you say that last part again about bigger rocks going up? Because when I see this, I'm like, maybe we shouldn't have a road right there,
Yeah.
like it needs to be relocated.
We
Maybe
talked
we
about,
money
we
to
talked
like
about it, but
engineer a new location, but
yeah.
you're talking about just making it higher or something, can you just say that again?
Well, you know, we talked about moving this road after I this couldn't, the feasibility of it was just crazy expensive, but we rebuild this road, and like I say, typically there would be, and picture a little narrower valley,
Okay,
but typically we would start building that road embankment at a
okay,
2-on-1 slope, a very shallow slope, because that's from an engineering standpoint more stable. But in doing so, we would actually fill in that floodplain space that the river just created.
okay,
So now we build out the base of the road, and then we use bigger rock to go vertical, because you can stack bigger rock.
got you, okay.
Big Montpelier. You know, those big stacked vertical walls of
Yeah.
rock give the Winooski River more space than if we built a 2-on-1 slope. And that space is good. So it costs more, you know, up along Stowe, we built vertical walls, number of places all over the state.
Rifkin has, you know,
Rifkin.
they broke out, wiped out over and over and over, and I noticed the rocks kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
Bigger.
Uh-huh.
And in Ripton, we opened up a flood chute that was blocked off purposely. One of those abandoned meander scars, we opened it back up and lowered the mouth of it. So now the creek can get into that feature, and it lowers the depth, and it lowers the scour power against the toe of that rock that we just invested heavily into. So these practices used in combination can make it more affordable and protect our villages.
They're recorded.
Thanks. It seems to me that the simple answer is, you know, don't try to move the river, move the road, or move the buildings.
Yeah.
There's two problems with that. One is just that you're dealing with fait accompli. I mean, it's there, someone owns it, you know.
Yeah.
But the other issue is in Vermont is topography.
Yeah.
Again, to get from my personal familiarity, the stretch of 107. Right on the Bethel Stockbridge town line. That washed out, and it didn't look like the road had washed out, it looked like there had never been a road. Okay, and that repair job, that was with Irene, that repair job held up,
Yes,
it looks like nothing happened.
that's right.
So that was some pretty solid engineering.
Yes,
It also is bullying the river.
it is. And you notice the White River is saying, well, if I can't go here, I'm going
We're
here.
gonna go there, yeah.
And you know, that's a classic location, Senator, where I've been in a car driving on 107 with somebody and they said, look at that eroding bank, isn't it terrible? And I would rejoin, it's beautiful. Now, with all due respect to whoever owns that land, of course.
Yeah.
The fact that it's widening there, it is
It's
building a
doing
new
what-
floodplain at a lower elevation, it's doing exactly what. It's a picture,
But the
it's,
topography is such, so let's stay with that particular
Yeah.
stretch of road again.
yeah,
You can't cut into that hill, it's too high and too steep, I mean, where would you put the new road?
that's right. Well, that's the conclusion we came to after
Yeah.
our reading, it's like, we'd have to go up on top of the mountain and the expense of that would be
Yeah,
outrageous.
that's a completely reroute.
So here we are in 2024 with the infrastructure that we have, with the villages that we have. And how do we work with these physical processes to try to minimize the power of the rivers that we helped create over time? And none of us know whether it'll be enough. For sure. But I think there's a lot of storage available in most of our watersheds, maybe not to the degree we have on Otter Creek below Rutland. But there is storage out there that's lost. And I think the best way that we have yet, even with our topography, is to try to find as much of that storage as we can. And work with the river. The river's working to restore that storage every flood. And that's why many of us work to develop the river corridor easement program, where we basically buy an easement on a stretch of river that's very dynamic. You know, to make it possible for that landowner, often a farmer, to let that river go through its evolution. Knowing that the benefits downstream for what is a very minor investment, often $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 to buy out a mile of river. Compared to the cost of the higher inundation and erosion forces downriver, because we didn't have that storage, it got built on.
So that, it's a great prequel to walking through the village we were talking about.
Yeah.
The bill.
If I may, it takes a few minutes to read through comments.
So that was really helpful. I have a feeling I'm gonna wanna, more questions are gonna come to mind, both in the coming weeks, but thanks so much.
My testimony to that, oh, should I wait for Senator to return or?
No, just not,
Okay.
press on.
My testimony today will be about two different paths that lie before us. One path will be expensive, but will be paid for by lower disaster recovery costs over time. The other path will be far more expensive with each successive flood going forward. One path will give us a chance to recover from floods more quickly because we dialed into ways that natural landscape features at a watershed scale and absorb storm runoff and release floodwaters more gradually. On the other path, we cut ourselves off from these natural defenses and spent millions buying out or slowly fortifying and increasing the number of structures placed in river corridors. It is the question of whether we're going to act now to protect and restore places where natural flood storage can occur, or turn our heads and let these landscapes fill with private and public investments that get damaged repeatedly. I strongly urge the legislature to get us out of this vicious cycle of river encroachments getting fortified with structures that fail during the next flood, or that shunt floodwaters downstream, causing damage to other properties. We need flood storage in watersheds upstream, and since we won't be building new flood storage reservoirs behind large dams like the Waterway Dam, we have to seek out opportunities to restore the natural flood storage we've lost due to historic land use and river management practices. We can protect our forests and forest soils that are regenerating after an era of deforestation. Intact forest blocks, riparian areas, and wetlands serve as sponges during the events. We can reverse or disconnect more of the drain and ditching that's been done in Vermont forest fields and wetlands and along the roadways. We can do more to infiltrate drainage flow before they get to the stream or river. We can strategically build new floodplains in or near our community centers to lower flood depths in our downtowns. These projects, along with floodproofing, for example, moving utilities out of basements, could make our historic sediments more resilient. And perhaps most importantly, we can limit new encroachments within mapped river corridors so that as rivers meander, they build and maintain the floodplains they lost when they were dredged, straightened, burned, and armored. Naturally generated floodplains dissipate erosive energy and store floodwaters, thereby sparing downstream locations that would be damaged otherwise. Vermont has been doing all of these flood storage and mitigation practices, but not enough and not always with intention. The state's watershed planning and funding is geared primarily toward water quality improvement, with flood resiliency described as a secondary co-benefit. I would urge the legislature to mandate state watershed planning and funding with flood water storage as a primary objective on equal footing with nutrient load reduction. I believe this would encourage more Vermonters and municipalities into the planning process. I would also urge the passage of S213 and the extension to state river corridor jurisdiction, because vulnerable communities and public infrastructure will only benefit from the flood storage and energy dissipation in river corridors and floodplains if they are protected at the watershed scale. The efforts of one town to address repeated flood damage by passing the river corridor protection bylaw are being frustrated when upstream municipalities either don't have the capacity or aren't willing to do the same. There is a great call for more affordable housing, which by definition, I believe, needs to go where there are services. We also know that most of our service areas, our villages and downtowns, are highly vulnerable to flood damage along our rivers. I believe it is a matter of risk management. If we employ the natural watershed storage described above, step back from the river's edge in downtowns where we can, floodproof and harden downtown infrastructure where need be, then the costs and risks will be lower than if new housing and other development were to sprawl out along our river valleys. In other words, existing settlements and road systems are generally safer with new infill housing between settlement boundaries. And those same settlements would be, if the new development were to be placed along otherwise unconstrained reaches of river upstream and downstream. We've made huge investments in protecting historic settlements and public infrastructure from erosion. More will be necessary, but the more a river is constrained from depositing and dissipating energy upstream, the more dangerous and damaging it becomes downstream. It is far more possible to manage risks in a few places along river's length than attempting to manage them along its entire course. Individual landowners cannot afford to armor a larger stream or river. They turn to the government program, the taxpayer, and I'm very concerned that when we use the public till to borrow every year to respond to multiple disasters and repeated failures, as we're seeing with climate change, then there will be less and less to spend on other pressing needs. We should focus on lowering our costs by continuing to invest in floodplain restoration as we have within the neighborhoods of Bennington, Brattleboro, Brandon, Barry, Ripton, Northfield, and Middlebury. We can also keep our costs down and reduce repetitive losses when we build or rebag to meet higher floodproofing standards. Vermont settlements and road networks grew up along rivers. If we are to both mitigate the cause and adapt to the impacts of climate change, it is both prudent and timely to combine with steps of promoting new infill housing and compact settlements while mitigating flood and fluvial erosion as proposed in S213. A state training course with the regional planning commissions on the technical process for creating and adopting infill maps within Vermont settlements should be created. Such a priority mapping would create greater efficiency for developers, municipalities, state programs, emergency managers, and environmental advocates. I would strongly urge the legislature to expand state jurisdiction of the river corridor protections under the flood hazard area river corridor board. A priority in the climate action plan for addressing the frequency and intensity of flooding that lies ahead, as outlined in S 213. I also urge that a state permit under the rule be presumptive in meeting the flood hazard criteria in Act 250. This would be way more efficient for all parties. New encroachments that result in heading in yet another segment of the river into an exceedingly narrow slice of its valley translates into the kind of adjacent and downstream destruction of neighborhoods, infrastructure and neighborhoods that we saw and I read in this past July. But in my previous role as state river manager, I know that such statewide jurisdictions may take additional regulatory staff, including floodplain managers and river scientists, as well as additional legal and administrative support. I believe the cost of additional or reallocated staff will be offset by a fraction of the annual savings that would be accrued from ending new structural encroachments in river corridors outside of settlement areas. I believe we can and must afford this, but if we don't, then I don't think state jurisdictions should be extended, because there's no way the rivers program could serve Vermonters effectively and fairly with the current staff. Thank you for the opportunity to provide this testimony. Please know that I would be happy to try and answer your questions.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for,
If we were to go ahead with, move as, say everyone agreed, S 213 is the basic plan for moving forward. In terms of implementation, you mentioned, staffing, but can you say a little more about what would it take to successfully implement 213 and have a robust program? And what's a realistic timeline to think about standing up such a big program?
Well, I'll start with infill areas. I think it's really key that moving forward with river corridor protection, we try to define not only where we shouldn't go, but where we can go. And I think this is it's a process that we worked very hard over 10 years to develop and put in practice. The current rule of protection procedure that the agency uses in Act 250, its limited jurisdiction under the rule, has put together a crafted infill policy to say, as I mentioned in my testimony, it's safer to put that house in between here, let's say where we're sitting now in the river, and to put that for Montpelier, than to put that same house up in Cabot or Marshfield. Because from an erosion standpoint, we've built the Montpelier Canyon. We're not letting the Winooski River wander over here from an erosion standpoint. All right, that's different than the whole FEMA inundation standards. Okay, where that same structure may get its feet wet, but it's not getting washed away. So I think the most important thing to standing up that program is to build out that process, work with the regional planning commissions, get that map in place, get it on the state adopted map. And then we're working with communities to say, here's where it's okay, again, from an erosion standpoint, where we are going to invest and fight back on the river, to say, here's where we can go. If we do that, it suddenly cuts down on the burden to the program tremendously, because you have far less, folks coming in to say, we'd like to build in that up valley location, because that community has been a part of that planning process. So that right away spelled out a little bit longer timeline. And I know the program would really prefer to work with its partners, extend out to municipalities to go through that infill mapping process while the rule is being stood up. There's so many inefficiencies right now in the way these hazards are worked on with communities that would go away, not go away, be much more reduced. For instance, right now in statute, a municipality must go to the state with any permit application to build in one of these hazarded areas that are involved in their bylaw. So somebody applies to a town for a development. If the town is following the law, they send that development to review to the state rivers program, who then comments back to the town, and the town makes a decision on whether to go forward with the state's recommendation. So already you have the state program working on all of these municipal reviews, as opposed to just saying, here's the permit. You can rebut it, you can appeal it, here's your permit. And it allows the state to use a consistent technical process compared to a highly variable, I mean, sometimes not even upheld process at the municipal level. The other inefficiency is Act 250. The proposal comes into the agency, it goes down to the rivers program, they comment on criterion 1D. That then goes to the commissions decide whether to do it, and in a few cases, we ended up all the way in the Supreme Court trying to defend the agency's position in that floodway termination through Act 250. If they held a presumption that the state permit, appealable again, was a rebuttable presumption under Act 250, that process would become much less time consuming on the program. So what I'm doing is I'm outlining all these ways right now that the program has its fingers in all of these things, but it has no real decision-making power. And that results in a lot of appeals. So between the infill mapping and kind of clearing up the process, you create a much greater possibility for the program to pull off statewide jurisdiction, again, in the map river corridors, which is not all river corridors. It's the 2 square miles and greater, which means it's our larger streams and rivers. It's a bite out of the apple, so to speak. It's doesn't take you all the way down to every trickle. So between those things, I think you know, you would have a program that's doable. If you gave it the right timeline to do the mapping and outreach, I think it would work.
Watson, then Senator McCollum. Just follow me into.
The permit process that you were describing. I just want to make sure that what you are asking for is already in 213, or is this not something that you see in 213?
The infill mapping is in 213. If there were an expanded state jurisdiction, and there was a state permit, I'm hopeful that some tweaks could be made to make that presumptive at Act 250, which is not in the bill now, I don't believe.
Okay, all right, that's what I thought. I just want to make sure.
Yeah.
Great, thank you for that question. Senator McCollum.
Thanks, correct me if I may be wrong, these things change. I thought the existence of the permit did create a rebuttable presumption.
No, right now in Act 250, the agency comments on criterion 1B back to the commission. There is not, unless it's already jurisdictional, it's a state structure, a state highway, the utility under Act Section 248. Any other large development does not require a state permit. It's only advisory to the commission right now.
Okay. Great. Any other questions for Mr. Twine? Senator McCollum.
It's complicated, but you're advocating rebuttable presumptions that are appealable. And there's a appetite for limiting appeals here. And this building has a magic bullet
Right.
to I don't know what.
Right now under Act 250, it's appealable, and that I've been to the Supreme Court 3 times because of the decision in the Act 250 process over the courts. That's a long, drawn out, convoluted process. Every state permit is appealable. And so you would be going to a direct appeal of an agency permit, as opposed to going through a process where now we might be against the district commission, granted a permit against the advice of the agency on hazards. And this was the Woodford Packard case that started this whole deal in 2002, 2003. where they were gonna put a retirement community on the banks of the Roaring Branch in Bennington. And the agency said, no, this is a bad idea. The river created that feature that you're gonna put, you know, all of these folks living on in these buildings. Commission went ahead and gave them the permit anyway. We went through a year and a half of legal wrangling, putting ourselves in opposition to the town, district commission. Ultimately, the Supreme Court sided with the agency, this is a bad idea. Later, the town said, oh, you were right, please help us with this problem. But we didn't have to go through that in my mind. If it was just simply a state permit. And, you know, it could have been appealed at that point.
Great, thank you so much, Mr. Klein.
Yeah, thank you.
With that, back to Ms. Oates, thanks for coming back. You know, we made sure time last, so this is. Taking time this time.
I feel like we all just earned an honorary degree in fluvial geomorphology, so thank you, Mr. Klein. And I hope that you'll stay so that when questions are asked, you're there. Okay. Good morning, committee. For the record, my name is Lauren Oates. I'm the Director of External Affairs with the Nature Conservancy in Newtown. I was here last week. I think I made about 1 page through my 3-page testimony, and I was trying to think about how I was gonna catch back up without having to read again. And given the depths of science that we just went into, I decided to take us on a hard right turn and just tell a story to get us started. I told you last week that prior to joining the Nature Conservancy, I was the state hazard mitigation officer, where I managed the FEMA hazard mitigation grant program for the state, which includes the FEMA buyout program. And that means that I went to a lot of towns in Vermont after a lot of different storms. And a handful of the people, the Vermonters that I met along the way have really compelled me to be advocating for this policy for a very long time. So I want to share at least one of those stories. This is going to sound fake almost. Through a blizzard, I drove my car on November 2nd to the town of Huntington, Vermont, in 2019. It was actually 3 weeks before I ended my term there, before jumping to the Nature Conservancy. But the town suffered catastrophic flooding on Halloween, 2 days prior. And the town had significant damage. A lot of homes were substantially damaged or destroyed. And the town reached out to me and said, we'd like to have a public meeting. We have a lot of homeowners who are really scared and they don't know what to do financially or what their next steps are. Can you please come talk about this program? So through that blizzard, I drove, and I was expecting, I've been to so many of these meetings before, you know, 5 to 10 homeowners, and there were 45 Huntington residents from the village at the town meeting that day. And I was listening to the stories that they were telling. I was hearing a lot of anger, as you can imagine, a lot of sadness, but the prevailing emotion in the room was fear. One woman, especially, her story has struck me, which is why I want to share with you all today. She lives right on the Huntington River. She had been there for several decades. This was not her first flood. But she told me that 48 hours prior to me being in that room with her, she found herself crawling into her attic to avoid a river that jumped its bank. To Mike's presentation earlier, it was a river corridor flooding where the river just charted a whole new course. It wasn't a rise and a fall. It was, the river was there and now it's in my living room. And she watched the waters rise quickly, and she climbed into her attic. And she said she felt like she was in New Orleans from Katrina and hearing the stories there. She was crying, I was crying, everyone was crying, while she told the story. And she said, I cannot live in this house anymore. I will not survive emotionally another spring flooding in this town. And that wasn't even a spring flood, that was a Halloween flood. But she had become so accustomed to spring flooding, she was anticipating that was her next moment of pain. Her house was actually not located in the FEMA mapped flood hazard area or the FEMA floodplain that Mr. Klein just described. So she wasn't technically eligible, through standard eligibility requirements of the FEMA, buyout program. We were able to eventually find money through a different source, because she had, enough damage and enough desire to leave. But that's just one discrete story, and I can tell you without exaggeration that I have heard hundreds of those stories across Vermont for the past decade-ish. And I asked, to what end will we keep allowing development in these places? Will we keep hearing these stories of people that are scared to live there? And last week I heard, we've got, Mr. O'Grady said you're gonna have to convince a lot of people. Senator McDonald, you said, who's gonna line up against this? And I said, perhaps again, optimistically naive, but by the end of the testimony, I hope nobody will. Because I truly do not understand how anybody would think that it is appropriate to place Vermonters in these high hazard areas. And for those that are already located there, to your point, if they choose to continue to develop that area, one, they're causing a potential direct harm to their neighbors. And two, when they do flood, they will be going to the taxpayers of Vermont and requesting help for how they develop their private property. So I'll start, that's why I decided to start today, and I'll go through my 4-point argument.
Can I ask a very quick question?
Yes, please.
And the Huntington, sorry, I remember that flooding and, you mentioned the word anger. So anger directed at whom about what?
Well, I'm not a psychologist.
No, but I mean, I'm just curious, like.
I think it's a really natural emotion.
Yeah.
It's anger that they're going through this, anger that their personal investment in their property is at risk and or obliterated. Anger that they didn't know that they were located in a high hazard area because the FEMA maps that they weren't. Just a natural, I think, emotion too. A lot of the anger is just directed at the speaker of the day, so me saying whether or not it would be eligible,
Thanks.
Yeah. So I have a 4-point, and then I'm only speaking to the river corridor and development part of this S213, though. I appreciate the testimony you heard last week to the other parts, and the Nature Conservancy is supportive of the full bill with a couple of minor tweaks. But for the river corridor piece that we're talking about here today, the 4-point case about how the status quo is not working is that it is unsafe, it is inequitable, it is extraordinarily costly to the taxpayers of Vermont, and it is really unfair and burdensome to our natural resources too. So I started last week with the inequity and status quo regarding public safety. I told you that there's a 4-fold increase in the number of Vermonters who live in lower economic quartiles and in mobile homes and mobile home parks than those in single family homes to live in these high hazard areas. And they started to talk a bit about the inequities in our more rural towns, having to navigate that patchwork regulation that Mr. Klein just mentioned. Mr. O'Grady started his testimony on this part with, it's a short part of the bill, but it requires a lot of background because it's confusing. And if it's confusing and we're asking our municipalities to do it, I think that therein lies a problem. So the burden that we're requesting of them to navigate, whether or not Act 250 was triggered, whether or not Section 248 of the PUC for an energy project was triggered, whether or not it's a FEMA map floodplain or river corridor, and did we adopt those river corridor bylaws or did we not? It's nebulous, it's confusing, and it's resulting in significant public safety concerns and development in these areas. Mr. Campany spoke to you last week. I've heard him in meetings when he talks about this, call it the Hunger Games approach in Vermont, where we are trying through so many carrots to get towns to do this very thing. Say, please stop developing these high hazard areas. We'll give you a lot more money after a disaster. We'll give you more access to competitive grant funding for your community after and before a disaster. And yet, we still only have 10%-ish of our towns that have actually adopted municipal river corridor bylaws. So that's not working. The carrots are no longer working. And Mr. Klein spoke to the conservation work that has been happening across the state. I think he listed almost every town that starts with a B. And then some more, where we've done significant floodplain restoration work, which obviates the need for things like buyouts, because you're creating that storage area to slow and retain the waters. But conservation in the absence of regulation is insufficient. We're at a regulatory need moment right now. Last week I showed you the litany of state plans that say, please do this. From the Forest Action Plan to the Vermont Climate Action Plan, which I think you're going to be hearing testimony on later this week. Every plan says that we should be doing this, so this is just us saying, please do this, but you need to capacitate appropriately. The second point, the taxpayer funded burden is incredible. We know based on climate trends, the climate assessment, that these storms are happening more frequently and in greater severity. So these are only gonna get costlier as we go. Since Tropical Storm Irene bore down on Vermont in 2011, the FEMA related costs for public assistance and hazard mitigation programs alone have toppled over $500 million. That is, we are spending tens of millions of dollars annually on these disasters. This is a very conservative figure. One, it's only those two programs. Two, it only accounts for certain damages. Three, it only accounts for certain damages during certain storms. So when we have those hyperlocal, Huntington got whacked, but Richmond next door was actually okay, we might have met a threshold for there to be FEMA funding. And so the state and the town has to come up with the finances to support that in full, and there is no federal taxpayer support coming in. So that 500 million is an incredibly conservative figure, but it's one to just throw out there to understand just how costly this is.
Can you say, I'm sorry, you said that's just two programs, so this is, what are the two programs?
The public assistance program from FEMA and the hazard mitigation grant program from FEMA. And those are only two programs, and the public assistance program is only for damages to public infrastructure. So it doesn't account for damages to homes, businesses. Again, incredibly significant. I told you, and you've heard a lot about buyouts in the last two months since the December hearing. The example that I pulled out then, and I'll bring back to the point now, is the fact that we're digging ourselves into a pretty deep fiscal hole here. For instance, a municipality can receive $2 million to buy out about 4 to 5 homes following a flood event. Those funds are necessary to get those Vermonters the financial wherewithal to make themselves whole and find a new home. And find a new home is not trivial, because we're in a significant housing crisis. Where they will find their new home is a challenge that has actually prevented dozens of buyouts from happening in this state. So you have $2 million, you're gonna buy 4 to 5 homes after a flooding event. However, that same town that's going to receive those taxpayer funded buyout dollars has not adopted river corridor bylaws. So they allow for development in hazard areas. So we just spent $2 million on that town to buy out those 4 homes, and next year they permit development of 5 homes, just a little upstream or downstream. So then the next year, we're gonna go spend 2 more. And you see how this continues and digs. Will we buy those homes out too after the next flood?
There's no eligibility for buyout requirement that relates to whether or not we've adopted bylaws.
There's not. You are more likely to receive those funds state and a competitive field. But it is not an eligibility requirement, no. And then just to note, because we like to talk about buyouts as like that's how we're gonna get ourselves out of this mess. There are 10,000 structures in the floodplain in Vermont. 10,000, and that's just the floodplain, that's not the river corridor. I'm not gonna do that math right now, but that's a lot. I think that's like a B problem, not an M problem, and that's just for buyouts. It's billion, not million. And then while we're talking about the money, not the homes, just because I have a note, you made a comment, Senator McCormick, about the gravel, and you have somebody, a constituent of yours, who just says, we just want to get the gravel back for the road. It was ours. It's our gravel. I'll agree. Also, Mr. Klein, originally the gravel was the river, but the town has taken it. I'll just say, how many times is it their gravel? Cause you're gonna pull it out, you're gonna build the roads,
Oh, yes, right.
it's just gonna keep happening,
And he acknowledged.
Yeah.
It's happened many times.
and it will continue to happen more.
You're saying the same ground gets hauled back up again?
And I think it gets pushed down to the next town, they can dig it out. You can take out the upstream towns,
It's, they're the same spots that built. Yeah.
year after year, yeah. The final point is about the natural resources component of this, which is inherently tied to our water quality. Which is where all the money is, which is problematic that we're considering flood resilience co-benefit or a byproduct. Though the two are inherently linked, what is good for flood resilience is good for water quality and vice versa. I think that we need to elevate the importance of both, if not flood resilience over water quality. The state plans that I mentioned, say that we need to find ways to reconnect our rivers to our floodplains, that we have to store and slow our floodwaters. I was actually going to use the hiking, analogy too. That, East Coast versus West Coast hikers, it's a lot easier to hike out there because they have switchbacks than it is here, because you have to use a lot more energy to go up and slow down coming down.
Vermont has more switchbacks than New Hampshire, so please.
We're easier than there for a lot of reasons. Those plans say that we need to right size our transportation infrastructure to adapt to our new climate. And I've told you that 75% of our rivers are disconnected from their floodplains, and that 75% of the damages occur from fluvial erosion or that in a river corridor, not in the floodplain. Protecting our largely undeveloped river corridors and floodplains for future development, supporting healthy forests, wetlands, and riparian areas. Those are the things we have to do to improve our flood resilience and consequently our water quality. Again, conservation in the absence of regulation is insufficient. When I was here in December, I put the flooding into a water quality context by sharing some preliminary data from the July 10th flood from the Lake Champlain Basin Program, which said that in the 5 days following the July 10th flooding this summer, the lake received 85% of its annual allocation for phosphorus loading under the total maximum daily load plan. 85% in 5 days. Ultimately, what you have before you in this part of S213 is about creating thriving communities alongside our thriving rivers. The status quo is unsafe, inequitable, it's extraordinarily costly to both Vermont taxpayers, Vermont residents, Vermont business owners, and Vermont natural resources. Let's see, I don't, some of this is no longer relevant because I kind of captured it last time, but I want to end actually the same way that Mike did. You're going to continue to hear testimony on this. Thank you in advance for hearing all of those testimonies. And you'll hear about limited capacity in state government. I think that's probably something that you're always going to hear about. And I'm here to echo what Mike said, that in order to do this well and to do this right, to decrease tax burden, to make Vermont more safe, more resilient, to changing climate, you have to capacitate the state rivers program to be able to do this and to do this well. State staffing capacity is really challenging. That's a tough nut to crack, and it's one that I entrust all of you to be really creative to find the resources to do, because this is about public safety above all, and I think that's the #1 reason that we have government is for public safety. So with that, I think I'm gonna wrap, because you all have heard a lot on this for several days now. So thank you for bringing me back. I'll say again, the Nature Conservancy is really excited to support S213 and has a couple of recommended changes to make it even stronger. And a little nugget for the future is between last week and this week, the Nature Conservancy has received some preliminary poll results from a Vermont public poll. Not that Vermont public, a public of Vermont poll. And I haven't gone through all of the data yet, but I was just looking on my phone because I just got it while we were in here. And the support for this policy is 67% versus 23% votes. So I don't think it's a hugely uphill battle. I'm happy to share this data once they're more tangible.
Thank you very much, Sarah McCormick.
FEMA has come up throughout this, and problems with FEMA. Do we need to adjust our policies to deal with the reality of FEMA, or do we need to be in touch with our federal delegation and see if changes happen at FEMA. They think we're the Mississippi Valley.
they don't account for the erosion hazards that we talked about. And that is hugely problematic from a funding perspective. From a policy perspective, Mike and I and others have continued to be engaged with FEMA on the issues that would, if changed, would make things a lot better for places that are topographically challenged, like us in West Virginia and Colorado. However, S213 actually does obviate a lot of those inefficiencies through making a more efficient approach to flood hazard regulation that would obviate the need for federal statute changes, which is what would be likely. And I'd invite Mike to amend anything I just said.
FEMA likes, there's parts of FEMA that like what Vermont's doing in Vermont.
Yeah.
And they give Vermont extra money to support the work we do in the living patterns. Changing the Stafford Act and changing some of their procedures around calculating these flood hazard areas. And redoing the maps is a much heavier lift for them that takes federal legislation. And I think as much as many folks within FEMA would like to see them evolve, they don't see it happening anytime soon. And so I agree with Lauren that moving forward with our program that not only looks after the erosion hazard, but helps us create better floodplain function, which is what FEMA looks at, is really the most prudent thing we can do.
And we already have the vehicle, the flood hazard area reporter rule already exists, it just needs to be amended, which is what's recommended in the climate action plan and was proposed in 2018.
So it will be helpful to us to be able to talk about costs, because, we're gonna. Where should we look for data that helps us? My sense is this is one of those investments that, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, that ratio, maybe that ratio is even off, maybe it's too low, but. Where can we look for data to help us look at costs of business as usual versus the proactive, prophylactic approach that we were talking about in 2013?
Well, all FEMA related disaster data are available. They're all part of the open public record, so I'm happy to send you resources for that. There have been some studies that have been done on a status quo versus here's what would happen if you did infill mapping and changed where, but that has been done on like a very discrete town by town basis. I think the town of Waterbury might have had one of those economic studies done, which if I can find that, I'd be happy to share it with you.
Okay, these rates. It's not usually use melodramatic phrases, but now that we're finishing up this morning, when it feels like these river corridors are a bit of a loaded gun. Like there's something waiting to go off. There are things that will happen, and I don't know that in general, the public thinks of them as such a public safety hazard. Waiting to run.
Until it does,
And then we are sort of sadly surprised.
yes.
Senator McDonald, then Senator White, then Senator McCormick.
In your experience, who are the people as a group or organizations that profit from flooding and who at the end of the year have they made more money than if there hadn't been floods?
Serpro, I think did pretty well, and Montpelier just saw their trucks around, but I mean, the honest answer is very few people, and that's why the National Flood Insurance Program exists, because the insurance industry, which largely profits off of disasters, has decided that, flooding there's no money to be made there, that's how costly it is. That's why the National Flood Insurance, that's why the feds had to come in and say, I guess we have to use taxpayer dollars because a for-profit industry will not touch this.
And to whom do the taxpayer dollars flow disproportionately when there are floods?
You have a thesis underneath here?
Serfra.
Yeah, I
I
know.
really, contractors who are going to potentially rebuild, I don't know that there's any.
Well,
Very little money to be made on flooding.
when we were looking at the revenues of the state after Irene, it was repeated often. That, oh, when you have disasters like this, it's good to the bottom line in revenues. And then they listed things like, people buy heavy equipment. There's workers have to come in from out of state because we're short and we need stuff in the motels, and the hotels are always full. People that operate machinery, get a lot of overtime, and there's, and in cases like down by the Eight Ring Village along, Route 100, they were, regulations were kind of suspended.
Yeah.
And the people that along there did what they damn well pleased.
Yeah.
So if we try and are they gonna welcome this legislation?
Again, I would hope so. Life safety.
Wouldn't some of it be against human nature to support that which
Profit or
occasionally
human life,
comes
maybe.
along and provides you with bonuses?
I would think that would be a very, very tiny and insignificant constituency.
Well, it's often the tiny constituencies that rule the roost with their
Very true, unfortunately.
Mr. Fine, you had some.
Yeah, I understand your point, Senator. But a lot of the practices that we also talked about today in terms of helping to build storage, especially along our transportation corridors. Maybe there isn't a huge hundreds of millions of dollars going into some of these selected industries, but if we turn our attention to working with these river processes to build storage where we can, especially along our roadways. I would venture that there would be more sustained funding for many, many years to come, decades come, but we have work to do that would benefit some of these same industries that maybe make a lot of money after some of these natural disasters.
and it's usually stockholders are most interested in the next quarter, not of the year, not the quarter of the century.
After Irene, I had companies coming in from all over the eastern seaboard wanting to. And came to this building. I had it many times. I had to meet with them and say no. They wanted to come in and rebuild our rivers. At a cost of millions of dollars per mile. And I said no. Because they wanted to build the river in a natural form, but they wanted to do it in a rigid way. The idea that it would stay just where they put it, that's where they were selling. And they would make a lot of money off of Vermont if we had said yes. So we would have had this false sense of security until the next flood. And so, yes, there are people who profit off of disaster.
And they will be lobbying against what is being proposed in the bill.
I don't know that they would necessarily. I mean, just because we do this doesn't mean there's going to still be disasters and suddenly all flood damage will go away. But cynically, there may be some folks that would say no.
Senator White, then Senator McCormick.
Thank you, Chair Bray. There was a quote that my husband and I repeat back to each other every now and again that we saw in a CBS documentary that covered like ocean levels rising and how all these folks had lifted up their homes. And the quote from one of the homeowners was, well, we didn't realize the roads were gonna be flooded too. So they like lifted up all their homes to then still not be able to really live there because the infrastructure underneath it wasn't, they weren't able to access their properties. So I'm wondering, not necessarily the same point that Senator McDonald is making, but the folks who are very clearly trying to get us to develop housing, which we are in desperate need of, may make cases for us building flood resilient buildings or having a code that allows for certain types of building in these areas rather than just outright making it more difficult or not possible to build. Is there any kind of development or use for this land that we would potentially be making more difficult to build in that would be appropriate?
So as drafted, S213 kind of accounts for this already, it's that infill mapping component that Mike mentioned earlier, that we have these areas, not there being one of them, where the river is pretty much incapable of moving the way that we would want it to, and where we would devoted a significant amount of public and private investment. There are ways, especially in the inundation areas, not the erosive areas, to build more resilient, move your utilities up to the first or second floor. If you were to build a new structure for parking on and then build. So there are ways to do that, and this bill accounts for development in these areas that are already developed. What it is saying is, let's not put more encroachments in the area that isn't. That would be creating a new hazard that does not already exist, both to the new development and the up and downstream communities.
Great, thank you.
General comment? No, I'm fine. That's when we do infill work, we sort of nervously worked on this before because of the idea that we start occupying space that we're gonna. There'd be less room for walk, and but I'm guessing that from what you're saying, there are ways to do infill development that have no sort of, you could call them hydrodynamic effects on adjacent property. Is that correct?
That's correct, and I believe it's termed no adverse impact from this bill.
Yeah.
So it would require that in order to build in these areas that we defined as suitable for infill and redevelopment, you have to demonstrate in the permit no adverse impact.
Actually, the permit issue. Riparian waters, plantings. Doesn't that interfere with the ability of the river to migrate?
No, it does not.
Stabilizes the bank.
It slows that without the vegetation, without the roots binding those bank soils, they will erode more easily, more readily. When you have a dense, multi-age riparian area, the water is slowed down overland, and that root structure, will create more resistance to the flow of water and slow that erosion process. But the river still moves. As the inside of a meander then grows with material, it pushes against that bank, and there is movement in natural systems. They continue to move in natural systems.
And to your point about fishing earlier, and again, this is lower on the reasons why we should do this, but it's still incredibly important. That natural vegetation provides significant shade, which cools the water and allows for significant biodiversity support for aquatic species.
Those trees fall in and they create cover for organisms, they create food for organisms. So that whole wood contribution to streams is very, very important from an stream ecology standpoint.
As opposed to the human instinct that says it's sort of messy, why don't we clean it up, right?
Yeah.
I remember at some point growing up, walking in the woods and realizing the woods are an incredibly messy place, like there's just havoc in there. It's not a park. It's not at all a park. So, but they seem to know what they're doing. Any other questions for our guests on?
I'm looking for the portion of the bill that talks about no adverse impact. So my computer is not functioning right now, so I can't do control F. You don't have to know.
Is it, but the
I was.
So we can talk about it later too.
Okay.
I mean, we're about to be done, so. The reason I'm asking is because.
Oh,
Did you find
the
it?
page 7, is it overlaid to wetlands?
It should be.
But it would be good if we had some kind of no adverse impact there too.
The mapping, I think,
I
starts.
believe no adverse impact is direct
Close to like
but it is,
$11.
it is a standard of the rivers program too, so.
It's a part, it's the standard in the rule, the existing rule is the no adverse impact standard for both inundation and erosion.
So is no adverse impact relation to adverse impact on the river features, or it's no adverse impact on the human?
It's the
Built.
natural, it's the function of the river protecting the. So no, you don't do anything that would create an adverse impact in the sense that it would create more inundation than what would be there otherwise, or more erosion that would be there otherwise.
I guess I'm thinking about Senator White's question. Because some of the conversations that I've had post July flooding, where there's this one strain of thought that's like, shouldn't build in floodplains, period. And then there's this other train of thought that's like, no, you can, there are ways to do it that are better than other ways, and there are some best practices if you're gonna build in a floodplain, you know, things like not having wood floors, like having, places that are easier to clean up, like anticipating that flooding is gonna happen. So the no adverse impact is not, I'm wondering, like, if you got a permit to build in a floodplain, is it gonna have this, contingency list of, this is what you need to do to build well in a floodplain versus, is it just about protecting the like the meanders? I don't know if my question is making sense.
It's getting more to like a building code.
Yeah,
versus,
is right, is exactly, is it
development.
gonna have building code implications?
On the inundation side, it is more of a building code standpoint. And when use compensatory storage, if you're gonna fill, then you need to create an offsetting storage.
Right.
There's flood proofing requirement. It is more of a building code. In the erosion hazard, no adverse impact. It's basically don't build here unless you're in an infill or redevelopment area.
Yeah.
And even then, you can be in the middle of I can think of some places in Vermont where even within a village center, the river's coming right at you. That would be a hazard to you as a new owner of a structure to
Right.
build there. And in other words, the way the standard reads is that your development can't cause the need for additional elements to stop erosion. Okay,
Mhm.
if you have to go in and completely armor the river in order to build your house right there,
Mhm.
that would not meet no
Right.
adverse impact. If you're building behind the Montpelier Canyon,
Mhm.
your structure is not going to result in any additional structure necessary to protect that building.
I guess that's where my question is so let's say we're talking about somebody building in the Montpelier Canyon, likely to flood. Where should those building best practices live? Does that make sense? Like, if it's not like that building code level advice, does that belong in this bill? Does that
It's
belong
in the rule,
elsewhere?
it's in the rule and the procedures that support, the technical procedures that support the bill, for the rule. So that's been in existence since 2015. And that I said, the department has a lot of experience of implementing with communities.
Okay,
And say, let's say you're in Montpelier and you're in the river corridor, but you're in this infill area, so we're saying you meet the no adverse impact for erosion. There's still inundation hazard codes that you would still need to meet, so one doesn't obviate the other.
Okay.
You need to look at both of those, and that's what the rivers program is proficient with. Is
and the river program has that list of best practices, they're already asking people to meet if they're in one of these
yes,
areas. Okay.
But they currently don't have jurisdiction over those areas, so they're saying. They're trying to educate towns on a town by town scale within a town, when somebody comes and asks if they should develop here are the things you should tell them.
And this would give them that jurisdiction.
Yeah,
So did that, are we talking about, sorry, let me follow up on this, make sure I'm getting through. The building code, the adverse impacts, we could be talking about either to your own property if you build there. versus if you build there, what are you doing to other people? And then what you're doing to other people. Doing to the natural landscape as well as to other people who share that space, like is adverse applied. Impacts on natural features of the area as well as other developed features in the area, or we only sort of adverse. It's focused on the natural resource impacts. I'm just trying to
It's
think,
both, your point,
which kind of adverse impact?
it's both, if you build somewhere that would have an adverse impact, it's essentially saying you will be altering natural flow in some way or another, or storage compensatory. And it will then have a negative impact elsewhere because it has to, that water movement will land elsewhere.
But if
Where
I'm
is that?
trying to assess the adverse impacts. Are they looking at what you did to the natural landscape, or are they looking at what you did to your next door neighbor?
It's.
Or maybe-
The rule is focused on human hazard.
Okay,
It is, you need procedures. It discusses the fact that there are impacts to the natural world, but the objective of the no adverse impact standard is to avoid dangers to the individual and what that individual might do to other property owners. So many of the other state planning processes, in which I mentioned, the whole water quality planning world, we recognize the tight nexus between protecting human safety through these mitigated measures, no adverse impact, and our desire for water quality and habitat as well. So, but in that rule of procedure, it's very focused on impacts to the human environment.
well, thank you, Nicole, and thank you, committee, for a really informative and interesting morning.